Hello there. Welcome to the Oven Hawk, a podcast discussing Star Wars news and Knights of the Old Republic. Today, I'll be discussing how to capture Dantooine cinematically in an adaptation of KOTOR. Spoiler alert for the Knights of the Old Republic series and the Star Wars films, TV shows, books, and all other media. This is where the lightsaber forging begins. Alright, in case you need a recap of what happens on Dantooine in Knights of the Old Republic. In Knights of the Old Republic, you arrive at Dantooine when you are fleeing the ruins of Terrace. You get to the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, and Dantooine is a world that was first mentioned, actually, in A New Hope, and it's kind of like a world of plains, kind of like the Midwest, or kind of like the savannas in Africa. It's just a world that you can kind of really connect with the Force and nature, but even like within all of that peace, you can kind of feel that something is off. And eventually the Jedi Council will talk to Revan, and Karth gets paranoid, and then Bastila will mention to the protagonist that she is trying to get the protagonist trained, and eventually Revan, he does talk to the Jedi Council, and the Jedi Council is very hesitant about taking on Revan as an apprentice because he's old, and Vrook is saying, like, some foreshadowing dialogue that it's like, ooh, the dark side, or should we be concerned, you know? What if Revan reappears? And it's like, what do you mean by that, Vrook? And in the midst of all this, Revan and Bastila, they share a vision of Revan and Malak at the Dantooine star map, kind of taking their first step into the dark. And this kind of shows you that Revan and Bastila definitely share some kind of bond, and the Jedi Council don't really answer all of your questions about why it exists, and Revan is confused. And eventually Revan trains and builds a lightsaber, and it kind of goes a little bit too well, almost like you've done this before. And among all of the lessons you learn, perhaps one of the most important is learning the Jedi Code. And eventually Revan will face his ultimate test in the Grove. Something is leaving a dark-sided taint there. He goes to confront it, and canonically he spares Juhani, who was a Jedi who had fallen to the dark side and just was kind of going through some hard times, you know, but he shows her mercy, and Juhani joins his party. And then eventually Revan goes to the strange ruins with Bastila, and there they find the Dantooine star map left by the Rakatans, and on the map they see 4 different worlds kind of blinking on the map, and those 4 worlds are Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manon, and Korriban. And in KOTOR, I would probably say canonically the order that they travel in is Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manon, and Korriban, but in a cinematic adaptation, I'd probably say they go in a different order, but that's just me personally. And then, just as Revan and Bastila and the Ebon Hawk crew are quested by the Jedi Council, and they're going off to their first world, Darth Malak finds out Revan is still alive. So that's kind of what happens in the game. So before I dive into what could happen cinematically on Dantooine, I just wanted to take this time to say that on January 31st, the Ebon Hawk podcast is going to be live on Patreon, and that we are running a giveaway on our Instagram page, Ebonhawk Podcast. All you have to do to enter is reshare the announcement that we're going to be on Patreon to your story, tag your friends in the comments, and you can enter as many times as you want, and that giveaway will end on January 29th. But without further ado, let's dive back into what Dantooine could look like cinematically in an adaptation. So how I kind of visualize Dantooine in an adaptation is the Ebonhawk crew flee Terrace, and they land on Dantooine, and Dantooine is different from everything Terrace stood for, where Terrace kind of stands for greed and corruption and separation. I think that Dantooine is more grounded in reality, and there's more of a peaceful center there that you can contemplate more there, and it's just more natural. And of course there's a Jedi enclave on Dantooine, and then the crew lands there. And I would say in an adaptation you want Mission, Zalabar, and Bastila to feel down that Terrace was destroyed. Mission probably the most of all, but Zalabar did live there for a long time, and Bastila, she would probably feel guilty that Malak kind of just glassed a planet to try to kill her. So I think she would definitely feel something about that. And speaking of Bastila, this is kind of her homecoming, but it's kind of like she's coming home, but in some unfortunate circumstances. It's kind of like you return home, but like there was like a tragedy like at college or something, or like there was a car accident and you're kind of coming back. The Jedi Council and Jedi of the KOTOR era are kind of like the prequel Jedi, except maybe even perhaps more extreme. Atris is a good example, even though she appears in the game Knights of the Old Republic 2. But I would actually kind of argue for her to be in Knights of the Old Republic 1, just to kind of have that bridge. And Atris kind of seems like she's down to do some sketchy stuff, in my opinion. Something is definitely off with them, and I would definitely have Karth be aware of it and alert the protagonist to something being off, because it kind of plays into his overall arc of him being betrayed, him learning to trust again, and then having to reforge and recommit to trusting Revan and crew after he kind of learns the truth. But yeah, I definitely want Karth to have a good arc, and I do think it's possible. The Jedi Council talks to Revan. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I would say, why not have some of the voice actors from the original games kind of show up in cameos? Some could be in makeup, some could be like aliens, but have some of the voice actors from the games be on the council kind of in cameos, you know? I think that'd be a cool detail. And in a way, this is kind of Revan's homecoming as well. It's just he doesn't know it. Bastila insists that Revan gets trained, and of course he does get trained. And I'm kind of thinking, like, in an adaptation, like, as Revan grows in the Force, so does the bond between him and Bastila. And I guess you could say it's like a Force dyad as well. But the key to movies or shows is you want to show the story visually as much as you can. And sometimes you do that through framing or the wardrobe music, but you don't want to have like a whole lot of dialogue kind of explaining everything. Like, as much as you can do visually, do it, you know? And it makes for a better adaptation. And one thing that could show, and does show, the growing bond is the vision that Bastila and Revan become aware of sharing, and it depicts Revan and Malak at the Dantooine star map, kind of taking their first steps into the dark. So I would say kind of give it like maybe an Inception-y or Sleeping Beauty-esque kind of twist or something. Or maybe it could be something that kind of grows with time. Maybe it kind of becomes more impressionistic or stylized as they get more visions, but find ways to make them unique and kind of stand apart from other depictions of visions, and just kind of showing like, this is what the star map looks like, you know, like make it interesting, you know, kind of progress the story, you know, kind of show where the characters are at. But yeah, then after kind of getting that first vision, I would say Revan, when you're showing the montage of training, I would say the Jedi of this era they kind of have a different kind of physicality, perhaps more like the prequels, but on steroids and thrown into the mud. Because these Jedi are the keepers of the peace, yes, but they're at war with legions of Sith and Dark Jedi. So they have to make do. And I would say, while the prequels, originals, and sequels have their own kind of fighting style, I would say, like, if you're doing KOTOR, kind of make it like the SWOTOR trailers and cinematics. And I would make sure that the stunts and the fight choreography kind of echoes fencing, historical European martial arts, HEMA, and martial arts from all over the world. Like, have those disciplines inform the moves, because it just kind of makes it more real, grounded, and physical, because I think they would be kind of more physical, and kind of like, if you think about it, like, war never really changes, but the way we fight does. Like, nowadays, a lot of fighting is done by kind of drones or just like kind of long range weapons, but back in the day, people would like use swords, you know, to fight each other. So it's like you're kind of hearkening back to that era. The grand technology exists, but this is a different time period, and different things are expected of the heroes. And I would intercret the vibroblade to training lightsaber to lightsaber training with lightsaber forging. And I've forged a sword, and I have to think that this could be a good opportunity to show the full forging process in a live-action capacity, you know? Perhaps Revan could find the crystal in a crystal cave, and that kind of is the spiritual aspect. But then having to put it all together, like the hilt and kind of making sure it all works, could be like the physical work, and maybe like you kind of have to have a balance of both, or maybe it can all be spiritual, but definitely show how to forge a lightsaber. Perhaps it's different from how we've seen it in some of the Clone Wars cartoons and Jedi Fallen Order, but yeah, just definitely show it on screen, like how to do it. I believe that Revan's Jedi class would be a consular, but I think he would definitely have the purple blade, because that's kind of just his color, you know? And over the top of all of the training and the forging, I would say probably the most important thing that Revan learns is the code. So I would definitely make sure that is included. And then I would say the ultimate test that Revan faces is when he faces what's in the Grove alone. And all the Jedi Council really knows or cares about is that there's a dark-sided energy there. And that they kind of just leave Revan to his own devices. And in a movie, I would have Revan be alone, because this is kind of his test. I wouldn't even have Bastila there. I would just kind of have her kind of be observing, like meditating from afar. Not using battle meditation, but she's connected, you know? kind of observing. Ultimately, you can have a fight, but Revan can prove that he's kind of been learning from the Jedi, and that he can do more than just swing a lightsaber blade, you know? He spares Juhani, and Bastila would be aware from afar, and she'd kind of be reflecting on the fact that he's unknowingly following in her footsteps of when she spared Darth Revan. And I would have Juhani played by a great actress, give her some great scenes, and she has a great story. But I wouldn't have her join the crew in, like, the first iteration of Knights of the Old Republic, just because I think, like, maybe the story could get a little bit crammed if there's too many characters on the Ebon Hawk at first. But that's not to say she wouldn't be included. But I would have her rescue the crew, possibly with Canderous in the second iteration of the Knights of the Old Republic adaptation. And I would almost maybe have, like, Canderous maybe have a falling out with the Ebon Hawk crew, or they just part ways, like, on Dantooine or Kashyyyk, because he just kind of has different priorities. And then maybe he circles back because he has learned some loyalty to Revan and the Ebon Hawk crew. But I'm still kind of figuring that out, like, because I do think Canderous has a good story, and in my mind, Canderous would probably best be played by Nikolai Coster-Waldau. But yeah, I would have the trio of Revan, Bastila, and Karth investigate the strange ruins to kind of be the capstone to Dantooine, and it kind of harkens back to the vision of Revan and Malak at the Dantooine star map. And I would definitely have the visuals of the star map be different, you know? Kind of more ancient, kind of more artistic, different. Maybe it could be tribal, and maybe kind of evocative of, like, I don't know, ancient Sumerian or Egyptian or something else kind of like along those lines. And perhaps maybe like the Republic's star maps could kind of evoke the medieval or kind of Renaissance kind of look of star maps, like kind of make them unique. And as the Ebon Hawk crew kind of goes planet to planet, it kind of fills in a bit more, kind of like a art piece. So it's kind of like a visual representation of the star maps being filled in. So anything you can make a visual, make it a visual. But yeah, in the game, I definitely think the order that Revan goes in, I believe that the order Revan goes to the planets in is Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manon, and Korriban, but I think the best ending for a first iteration ends on Kashyyyk. And then a second iteration, I can't decide if I would start on Manon or Tatooine first, but it's kind of like Manon is water and then Tatooine is a desert. I think they contrast well. And then I think Korriban makes the most sense when you know who you are. Like, you know that you were Darth Revan. So I would probably say Kashyyyk, Tatooine, or Manon, second and third. And then last would be Korriban, and then you get to Lihan and the Starforge. But after the Ebon Hawk crew, kind of led by Revan and Bastila, they are tasked by the Jedi Council to investigate all the star maps, and that kind of sets them on their quest. And as they leave, in the game, the perspective shifts to kind of like the dark side. I believe it is the Leviathan where Darth Malak is, and Darth Malak kind of finds out that Revan is still alive. So I wouldn't end the first movie there. I would end the first movie on Kashyyyk, but in the future, we'll talk about Kashyyyk and kind of how and who we would cast as Jolie Bindo, and kind of how we would end a first iteration, whether it's a show or a movie. So that's how I imagine Dantooine Cinematically, and yeah. But yeah, before I close out, I just wanted to make a plug for Apple Podcast reviews. When you leave us a 5-star review, it fills up our star map so more people can find us. And we're always appreciative of all the reviews we get, and wherever you subscribe, whether that is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else, that helps us get found as well. And whenever you share any of our posts, or if you just kind of like are at a bus stop and you just mention like, hey, I'm listening to this podcast, that helps us out, and we're always very appreciative. So let me just dive into the closeout, and yeah. So anyways, this has been the Ebon Hawk Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at Ebon Hawk Podcast. And the Ebon Hawk, like I said, can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, as well as everywhere else that Anchor Podcasts are distributed. Subscriptions, reviews, and shares help us out immensely. And then Coden wasn't able to be here today, but he can be found on twitch.tv/CodenBon. He typically streams Thursday evenings, 6 to 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And he's also on Instagram at CodenBon. And our intro and outro themes were composed by Alistair Schorman at alistairsounds.wixsite.com/alistairsounds. This has been the Ebon Hawk Podcast. May the Force be with you. We will be back soon. Bye for now.